This is Duke University.
In contemporary America, journalists, pundits, and social scientists regularly weigh in on the potency of Latinos' liberal orientations and their loyalty to the Democratic Party. Latinos are more likely than other Americans to say they're liberal, reported an online publication in 2012, and they relied on poll findings released by the Pew Research Center that year. Analysts at that same think tank later compared data from 2012 and 2016 and found that party affiliation among Latino registered voters remained relatively unchanged. Approximately 2/3 of those surveyed identified with or leaned towards the Democratic Party. This inclination did not necessarily translate into a wholesale embrace of Democratic policies or Democratic candidates, a fact acknowledged by researchers and commentators alike. How many Latinos would actually vote in the 2016 presidential election remained to be seen. And Pew experts made clear that things were to be seen. Earlier that year, in January, Roberto Suro, a policy professor at USC and a regular commentator for the New York Times, reproached Latinos, quote, lackadaisical approach to civic engagement, end quote, as evidenced by lower voter turnout than African Americans and whites. Whatever happened to Latino political power, Suro wondered, brooding over an aspiration yet to be realized. He suggested that the influence that ultimately matters had to be displayed on the national stage. These present-day reflections are instructive as they are generative. Presidential elections obviously have significant repercussions. A healthy and inclusive democracy demands that Latinos and all citizens be motivated and allowed to vote. These recent surveys on Latino political life should also inspire us to scrutinize the deeper historical production of political subjectivities and the processes of civic participation. Determining why Latinos vote or not necessitates a probing of the dispositions, the institutions, and the movements that have inspired or hindered electoral participation in the past and in the present. Now, I believe that that undertaking is best accomplished by considering local context and local dynamics, which have tended to color the kinds of civic life that people see as possible. Attending to the political potential of Latinos at the national level should transpire alongside analyses of how clout is and has been acquired, exerted, and lost at the local level. It behooves us then to approach Latino political action expansively, attending to its diverse incarnations while uncovering its historical roots. Contemporary deliberations on Latinos as liberals or liberal-leaning should impel us to consider the following. How and why did this orientation take hold? What has this political inclination meant exactly, and how has it unfolded over time? If current projections hold true, Latinos' political proclivities will prove critical for the future of liberal America, or perhaps conservative America. These demographic forecasts make historical inquiry more imperative, ascertaining why Latinos gravitated to American liberalism, how they challenged and reformulated it, and what demands and concessions they have made along the way exposes the potency as well as the malleability of this ideology in Latino life. Now, these are some of the preoccupations guiding my book, Latinos and the Liberal City, from San Francisco's big strike to gay liberation. The book is essentially an analysis of Latino and Latina political life. The story I tell aligns with what political historians Meg Jacobs and Julian Selliser classify as sociocultural political history. In doing this approach acknowledges the role of non-elite groups and the grassroots in shaping government policy, electoral outcomes, social movements, and other facets of civic life. Latinos and other ordinary San Franciscans did just that by participating in a host of campaigns, initiatives, debates concerning labor and civil rights, poverty and economic opportunity, urban renewal and gentrification, and gender relations, sex education, and homosexuality. So before I share some brief selections from the book, I want to accentuate the three key takeaways, the three key takeaways from this presentation. So first, Latinos in San Francisco began to seriously engage with liberalism in the 1930s. Over the past 25 years, historians of American history have offered rich accounts of how white ethnics, with Italian Americans being the preeminent example, as well as African Americans, gravitated to the liberal project during the Great Depression. Yet Latinos wrestling with liberalism has largely been explained and continues to be explained as having started later, as having emanated in the mid-1960s. Latinos are always latecomers, newcomers. My research shows otherwise. Two, their engagement with liberalism was not a theoretical enterprise. I write about unionists, civil rights warriors, housing activists, sexual liberationists. Most of them, whose work I trace, had not read John Locke, John Dewey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jane Jacobs, or Simone de Beauvoir. So they grappled with liberal worldviews or liberal agendas at the grassroots as part of their political practice, as part of their vision grounded in lived experience. Third, my contention is not that all Latinos became liberals or even identified as such. The bulk of the historical actors whose work I investigate and write about wouldn't have called themselves liberals. They didn't go around saying, I'm a liberal. Yet the processes of becoming political subjects and their processes of civic participation in the 20th century city cannot be understood or extricated from their attention to liberal ideas, policies, and campaigns. A liberal city par excellence, San Francisco offered an optimal setting for an historical investigation of Latino political life. Its ethno-racial profile has belied the white-black binary since its founding, and the city has housed a motley Latino population since the mid-19th century. So it's often very surprising when I tell historians, trained historians, that there were Chileans and Peruvians in San Francisco in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, that there were Central Americans and Puerto Ricans that settled in San Francisco in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, etc. Now, politically, San Francisco's dynamic history of organizing, civic action, and dissent has marked it as a progressive metropolis. Now, this legacy of activism has its roots in the big strike of 1934, a maritime work stoppage that morphed into a general strike and transformed the citizenry relationship to the polity. Latinos' involvement in the 1934 uprising has rarely been studied. The significance of the big strike itself has become eclipsed by scholarly attention to, as well as popular fascination with the 1960s counterculture, as well as the city's sexual revolution. So what many students, tourists, the public at large today identify as liberal about San Francisco, its celebration of cultural nonconformity and sexual diversity, owes much to the ascendancy of multiculturalism and the tempering of an older tenet of liberalism, what legal scholar Ruel Schiller calls economic egalitarianism, dominant for some decades after the big strike. Whether approached from the 1930s or the 1960s or the 1970s, Latinos remained relegated to the sidelines of San Francisco's history specifically and urban history more broadly. We are thus left with a portrait of a population residing in one of the country's most liberal metropolises, yet insulated from, uninvolved in, unconcerned with its political affairs, the political affairs of the state of California, the political affairs of the nation. A few words about liberalism are in order before I move forward. Liberalism, as understood since the New Deal era, refers to a political philosophy broadly sustained by the principles of activist government, societal reform, freedom, and a belief in progress. Scholars, including your own William Chafe, have called attention to liberalism's multiple meanings, its contradictions, what Gary Gersel at Vanderbilt calls its protean character. My book teases out this versatility as exhibited in proposals and policies involving government interference in economic affairs, the range of state-sponsored social welfare in the course of social relations in a multicultural nation. By applying liberalism as an interpretive thread, I map out the continuities, the alterations, the disruptions in Latino political life. So in effect, I'm using liberalism both as an ideology and as this interpretive tool. It serves as a connective tissue across historical eras. And in doing so, I attempt to tease out Latinos' diverse aspirations and priorities, their varied articulations of citizenship, and their evolving sense of rights. Latinos' pursuit of rights, power, recognition, representation, emanated first and foremost from their labor unions. Their participation in the strikes of 1934 presaged the centrality, the vitality of labor organizing in their lives. Labor unions would become the most prominent sites of activism for the next quarter century. Now, one of the most formidable organizations, the ship scalers unions, drew men, and by the 1930s, some women as well, who cleaned and conditioned ships while stationed at the waterfront. Think of them as the janitors. They cleaned the ships when they returned from wherever they had come from and before they went off to wherever they were going. Most of its members were Latinos and African Americans, though some whites and some Asians also engaged in scaling work during the Depression years. In early May 1934, Jacinto Penalver, Armando Ruiz, and hundreds of others joined this new union just days before the longshoremen initiated a coast-wide strike. The stevedores had considered this action for many months, and now, together with all maritime workers, succeeded in shutting down San Francisco's port. As workers pressed their demands, including union recognition, a closed shop, a 30-hour work week, shipping companies insisted on their prerogative to set the terms of employment. and used various strategies to continue their operations. The immediate result was violence. San Francisco's waterfront metamorphed from center of economic activity to industrial battlefield. Bloody conflict, excessive police force over many months, and then the eventual occupation by the state's militia amplified calls for a general strike, which began in mid-July of that year. All city unions and much of the public at large took part in it. They brought the preeminent Western metropolis to a standstill. They shut down all commercial, transportation, industrial operations in San Francisco, in this preeminent Western metropolis. Now, for those of you who, like me, are Gen Xers or folks of the previous generations who are boomers, you've heard about the great anti-Vietnam War demonstrations that took place in San Francisco. They never shut down the city in the way that something like this general strike did. So the magnitude of this event had not been seen before and has not been seen since. In participating in this strike, San Franciscans challenged corporate might, and they defended labor unions' right to exist and to make claims on their employers. The scale of public support, concerns about the escalation of the strike, concerns about what it would do to economic life in the city and the region, propelled ship owners to resume negotiations, accept governmental arbitration, and this led the city's labor council to declare the strike over. Now, the longshoremen witnessed how the bulk of their demands materialized within weeks. This was not the case for the scalers, in part because they were marginal workers. They were in a relatively new, in a small union, unlike the longshoremen, and they did not have any representation in arbitration proceedings. Still, the stevedores still, the scalers found hope in the precedent set by the stevedores, and soon they found great hope in the proposed legislation and eventual passage of the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, passed in summer of 1935. That federal law cemented the New Deal covenant with labor by guaranteeing industrial workers the right, government-sanctioned right, to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. Wonderful. However, government policy did not translate into immediate employer acquiescence. As the scalers quickly found out, their bosses would not honor these government-sanctioned rights unless they fought for them. So they struck in August, challenging ship owners' continued reliance on labor contractors and their adherence to the open shop. A few employers acceded to scalers' demand, but most opposed doing so. The strike continued, and then tensions escalated as some dissident union members, paid off by labor contractors, questioned the strike's aims and wreaked havoc at union meetings. In September, MLA sent about a dozen scalers to the hospital and a dozen more into police custody. 4 of them soon found themselves facing charges of assault with intent to murder. The scalers' union responded by mounting a vigorous campaign to defend their members and to defend their union. Unionists construed the murder charges against Archie Brown, Julio Canales, and 2 others as an effort to smash their union. They regarded the men's prosecution as a machination engineered by ship owners seeking to tarnish their union's reputation and to stymie its growth. The people and interests we work for, the scalers explained, wanted to discredit the union and to stop progressiveness and militancy. Their perspective fit within a body of thought shared by other waterfront laborers who also denounced union busting schemes, red baiting, and other tactics to curb workers' rights. Like-mindedness in the fraternity forge during the big strike now proved essential. The labor press rallied all maritime laborers to stand with the scalers and exert public pressure to exonerate the accused men. Longshoremen and others did so. They attended street protests, packed court proceedings, and eventually participated in a scaler-led work stoppage. Men have a right to organize, a right to be heard, a right to strike, and a right to be free from boss and employer-inspired riots, affirmed the scalers in December of 1935. 1 week into their colleagues' trial, their declaration conveyed two unequivocal stances. Unionists made clear that their ordeal involved an attack on their rights as workers. And they decreed that they would not relinquish their union principles nor their rights protected by federal law, vowing to preserve them, vowing to fight to preserve them. Their pivotal offensive consisted of a labor moratorium, an action endorsed by the Longshoremen's Local, the Sailors Union, and the Maritime Federation of the Pacific. Days before Christmas, all members of the city's seafaring unions, and shoreside unions as well, ceased working for about 30 minutes. Protesting the frame-up, they issued a message of collective outrage and solidarity. They also signaled the potential of future dissent if the jury issued a guilty verdict. An acquittal days before the new year of 1936 neutralized the prospect of heightened waterfront unrest. Scalers' own mobilization and their backing from their maritime allies proved vital in the men's exoneration. One supporter actually identified mass pressure and protest action as the key factors behind the exculpation, even though unionists could not quantitatively assess how their grassroots campaign influenced the jury's decision. The clamor during and since the big strike must have reminded jurors that waterfront workers would not accept a conviction quietly. The recent work stoppage confirmed that working-class indignation would have consequences for employers and the city at large. Workers had much at stake. The case threatened the lives of 4 innocent men in the continuation of progressive unionism. To be a progressive unionist in 1930s, 1940s San Francisco meant to commit oneself to direct action. It meant pushing for pro-worker government policies and citing, promoting, making it possible that jobs were available to everyone, irrespective of race, national origin, or political ideology. Employment, civil rights, and the public's will took center stage in 1958 as California voters considered a right-to-work initiative under Proposition 18. Engineered by the Citizens Committee for Democracy and Labor Unions, an outfit of anti-labor forces despite its name, the proposal made it unlawful to deny or curtail employment based on membership or non-membership in a labor organization. In effect, it sought to invalidate the union shop by affixing the principle of voluntary unionism to the state's constitution. Supporters insisted that the amendment would expand job opportunities, would protect workers' individual rights, and guarantee everyone's freedom of association. City labor circles found the initiative troubling and identified it as an attempt to erode unions' power, divide working people, and restores employers' unrestrained authority over employees. Echoing arguments made by organized labor in other parts of California and other parts of the country, the Labor Council charged that the right to work arrangements would stamp out collective bargaining and actually nullify job security obtained through a union contract. Individual unions and civic groups pulled Latinos, including the Alarid family, into the No on 18 campaign. Claude Alarid belonged to the Plumbers and Pipefitters Union, Local 38. Ruth was active in the United Latin Americans of America, a civic association established in 1949. They both volunteered with an organization, a committee known as the Latin American Committee for Defense of Our Jobs. This ethnic-oriented committee, sponsored by the Labor Council, connected unionists with civic advocates, and they jointly spurred Latinos to vote against this initiative, signaling the maturation of an alliance nourished by a shared investment in unionization and civil rights. The Latin American Committee determined that Proposition 18 threatened job security and actually sustained discrimination. Its members told friends and neighbors what its passage would really mean: reduced salaries, a loss of union benefits, and less opportunities for racial minorities. This prognosis stemmed from fears of the open shop, as well as knowledge that the people that backed Proposition 18 were also consistently opposed to fair employment legislation. With an eye to political numismatics, activists cast the destruction of union jobs and resistance to non-discrimination as two sides of an employer-minted coin. Pecuniary alarm bred social anxieties as well, especially those involving familial stability. Relying on the popular, potent imagery of the nuclear family, and especially housewife and male breadwinner, the Latin American Committee cast Proposition 18 as inimical to domestic cohesion. Do not destroy, so I'm quoting here directly from this flyer that you see before you. Do not destroy your household's union, the group told Latinos. Protect your family's security. Now, the warning likely persuaded family-oriented Latinos, even if their household arrangements did not conform to that societal ideal. Others may not have been swayed by these elaborate or allegorical arguments. Proposition challengers had one basic message for them: the measure did not guarantee or create jobs for anyone. In and outside of this committee, Latinos advanced the tradition of grassroots campaign work and political education first expanded by their counterparts in the early 1940s. The 1958 election season found electrical workers Luis Hernandez and Robert Parra disseminating the unpleasant facts about the right to work proposal. And they did so in street corners, transportation hubs, and other public areas. They were but two Latinos who took part in canvassing, distributed leaflets, and reminded Spanish-speaking residents that their, quote, first vote should be no on Proposition 18. Their precinct activities complemented voter registration drives coordinated by the labor councils and United Latin Americans. These overlapping efforts from the bottom up doubtlessly influenced the electoral results. Approximately 70% of city voters rejected the proposition, and it was also beaten by a wide margin in the state. Between euphoria and relief, the Alarids and their friends felt pride in having done their part to preserve labor rights. Labor, civil rights, and sexuality converged by the late 1970s. In 1978, all Californians had to consider gay people's standing in their state while reflecting on the scope of human rights. Amidst a nationwide movement to rescind rights and liberties that gay men and lesbians had fought for in the preceding decade, State Senator John Briggs led a statewide drive to codify discrimination and exclusion in the name of morality and the protection of children. Soon known as the Briggs Initiative, the proposition's intent was clear. Any person engaged in, quote, public homosexual activity or conduct would be dismissed from or refused employment in the public schools. Gay people and their allies began organizing against the proposed measure even before its backers had gathered enough signatures to put it on the November 1978 ballot. Pointing out that the Briggs plan threatened all gay Californians, gay activists also stressed that its passage could well embolden other right-wing forces to increase their attacks on civil liberties and on all oppressed groups. Those residents drawn to California Save Our Children refuted charges that their effort amounted to persecution and instead identified homosexual teachers and their allies as a societal threat. Briggs and his supporters presented themselves as guardians of public welfare, arbiters of morality, and warriors against social death. They believed gay teachers would cripple and corrode children's moral and psychosocial development and should therefore be removed from the public schools. Gay and straight San Franciscans rebuked Briggs's design and resolved resoundingly to thwart it. Now, Briggs had regularly chastised San Francisco for its liberality and the visibility of its gay and lesbian population. Many local residents reciprocated the antipathy, charging Briggs and his supporters with intolerance and the promotion of state-sanctioned bigotry. They mobilized their opposition within existing political collectives and new alliances that pulled diverse constituencies into the fight. One well-known coalition, Bay Area Committee Against the Briggs Initiative, BACABI, counted civil rights groups, labor unions, and religious bodies among its members and endorsers. Staging community meetings, press conferences, and rallies throughout 1978, BACABI coordinators consistently underscored the imperative of assembling a united front to prevail over Briggs's forces. After all, Proposition 6 raised paramount questions concerning equity, prejudice, worker rights, and constitutional protections. Gay Latinos understood the initiative's ramifications and joined the No on 6 campaign in various ways. Some involved themselves in the day-to-day activities of BACABI. Some in their interpersonal relations with friends and family beseeched Latinos to remember their experiences, past and present, of being devalued, of being hated. They also labored to dispel the myth of gay people as sexual predators. In a press interview, Eddie Baca emphasized, quote, "The greatest danger for the Latino child is the educational system, crime, violence, and drugs, not homosexuals." Challenging Briggs's position head-on, he simultaneously stressed that the senator's allies also opposed the advancement and civil rights of racial minorities. The followers of Anita Bryant and Senator Briggs, who supported Nixon, are ultra-right-wing conservatives, Baca relayed, and were the true enemies of the oppressed people, end quote. His comrades in the Gay Latino Alliance shared his sentiments and emphatically urged heterosexual Latinos to stand up for gay rights. Another contingent of Latinos proved particularly critical in challenging this proposition: education professionals. The initiative spotlight on teachers, teachers' aides, counselors, and administrators generated intense opposition from those laboring in the educational sector. While gay rights activists deduced that the proposal imperiled gay people of all occupational backgrounds, educators concluded that it would harm everyone in the ranks. Anyone who worked in the public schools could be harmed, irrespective of their sexual identity. Briggs hurts us all, declared the San Francisco Teacher, the newspaper of the city's Federation of Teachers, Local 61. The labor union identified Proposition 6 as an anti-teacher, as an anti-gay, anti-individual rights measure. Its statewide partner, the California Federation of Teachers, concurred. So did the city's Latin American Teachers Association, or LATA. An outgrowth of a Latino caucus within Local 61, its members expressed solidarity with gay co-workers early on, attended rallies, and conveyed teachers' viewpoints to friends and family. In one-on-one conversations and before large crowds, Roberto Lemus, one of LATA's representatives, explained why his colleagues spurned the initiative. It authorized discrimination against the minority population, threatened job security irrespective of work performance, embodied an invasion of personal privacy, and violated First Amendment rights. Lemus and many teachers found the language of homosexual conduct as grounds for dismissive particularly problematic and loathsome, because any person who expressed favorable views about gay people, anyone who discussed homosexuality as a normal expression of human sexuality, or who challenged discrimination based on sexual orientation, stood to lose their job. An impressive roster of Latino educators echoed LATA's perspective. Proposition 6 is a serious threat to the civil rights for which we have fought for in this country, relayed Rosa Perez, an administrator at San Francisco City College. Her appeals share much in common with Eddie Bacchus's from Gala, but the respect afforded to teachers in Latino life and the prominence of community leaders like Rosario Anaya, who sat on the city's school board, meant that their perspectives carried much more weight than the weight carried by Baca and his counterparts in Gala. If heterosexual Latinos, especially those with children, could easily discount Bacchus's position without much thought, Latino educators, their opposition pushed heterosexual Latinos to reflect more deeply about the stakes before them. Other labor unions, civil rights organizations, and the Catholic establishment also voiced their opposition to Proposition 6. I'm going to skip a section here because I know I'm running a little over my time, but one of the unions that I found particularly striking, that came out against Proposition 6, was the Union of Construction and General Laborers, Local 61. And their stand against the proposition was particularly striking because it demonstrated how Latino laborers in a hyper-masculine industry also found Proposition 6 dangerous and prejudicial. For popular views on the measure, Latinos could turn to at least 4 Spanish-language or bilingual newspapers. None of the mainstream publications endorsed the proposition outright, though some publications chose not to address it, mainstream publications for Latinos. El Mundo and El Bohemio had a record of covering electoral politics and statewide initiatives. They remained silent on the matter. In doing so, editors conveyed that proposition was not of concern to Latinos, too contentious for consideration, or perhaps both. Their counterparts at Tiempo Latino acknowledged the controversy while opting for neutrality, reminding the public of the many things at play, including their children's education and, quote, the human factor of homosexuals themselves, editors encouraged readers to consider their conscience and use common sense when making their decisions. A commentator known as Don Cuca, writing for that same newspaper, struck a different tone and circuitously recommended voting against it. Don Cuca used parody, innuendo, and homophobia. He mocked gay people and he himself and branded homosexuality as a sexual deviation, and yet told his audience that fairies had a right to work. If the proposition passed, Don Cuca wrote, the proposition could easily be borrowed to make a bed for anyone accused of philandering or being sexually adventurous. Gerardo Ramos, the creator of the cartoon in front of you, worked for the left-leaning El Tecolote, and he likewise relied on humor to convey his message. Politically sharp and coalitional in orientation, his cartoon cast all oppressed peoples as Brix's targets. Attention, raza, read a speech balloon. So this is the, this is the English version. Apologize, read a speech balloon. This guy is the same one who has persecuted us. Vote no on 6. Ramos's recommendation fell fully in line with El Tecolote's position. Its team did not mince words. Proposition 6 was anti-gay, anti-labor, and dangerous to all teachers, and was backed by conservative elements in our state. El Tecolote's editorial team wanted Latinos to recognize the proposition's importance, understand how it would directly affect their lives, and vote it down. Now, the range of outlooks presented in the press, I believe, mirrored Latinos' varied positions and assessments. Some Latinos likely voted and supported the proposition, or they just abstained from voting. More among them turned to the recommendations of teachers, labor unions, and religious leaders, and opposed it. Part of the reflection recommended by Tiempo Latino, after all, involved weighing what educators and moral teachers had to say. Residents who wavered, who found themselves in the middle, simply could not ignore the perspectives disseminated by community groups, friends, relatives, who stood adamantly against the proposition. In the end, about 75% of San Francisco voters rejected it. 60% of the state's electorate did so. The outcome in the districts with high concentration of Latinos paralleled the citywide margin. Non-Latinos, of course, lived in heavily Latino areas, but the electoral results, alongside the responses from individuals and institutions connected to Latinos, indicated that more of them opted to acknowledge gay people's humanity, protect labor rights, and stand on the side of equality. So what to do with these historical nuggets? I don't have much time, so I'll make it quick. First, these episodes underscore Latinos' central preoccupation with labor rights and economic security. These issues consistently propelled them to action. 2, my comments highlight the necessity for broadening our conceptions of what counts as Latino causes or Latino concerns. Notice that I have not brought up immigration, which is the go-to issue by historians and by political scientists when thinking about Latino political life. Lastly, and simply, to understand why Latinos gravitated towards liberalism or why they might pull away from it in the future, we must consider the conditions, the aspirations, and the coalitions at the grassroots. Thank you.